Tonight, we're stepping into a kind of kitchen most modern cookbooks forgot. A place where practical wisdom mattered more than fancy ingredients, and where cooks relied on simple tricks that quietly solved everyday problems. Old community cookbooks, handwritten recipe cards, and early Betty Crocker guides were filled with these ideas, small shortcuts and clever habits passed from one cook to another. Some might sound strange today, but many of them worked surprisingly well. In this video, we'll uncover 10 vintage suppers and the oddly useful hillbilly-style cooking tricks that helped make them possible, methods that once saved time, stretched ingredients, and kept family tables full. Creamed chipped beef on toast. Long before trendy brunch cafes started serving gourmet toast, American kitchens already had their own humble version. One of the most recognizable was creamed chipped beef on toast. It appeared in many mid-century Betty Crocker cookbooks and was a familiar sight on dinner tables from the 1940s through the 1960s. Cheap, filling, and quick to prepare, it was exactly the kind of supper busy families relied on. The dish itself was simple. Thin slices of dried beef were warmed in a creamy white sauce made from butter, flour, and milk. The salty meat blended into the sauce, creating a thick, comforting mixture that was poured generously over slices of toasted bread. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm, rich, and satisfying after a long day. But what made this meal even more interesting was a clever hillbilly kitchen trick that cooks quietly used for generations. Dried beef was famously salty. If you cooked it straight from the jar, the entire dish could become overpowering. Rural cooks solved this with a surprisingly effective method. Before adding the beef to the pan, they quickly rinsed the slices in warm water or soaked them briefly for a minute or two. This simple step washed away just enough salt to balance the flavor without removing the meat's distinctive taste. It was a small trick, but it changed everything. The sauce became smoother, the flavor more balanced, and the dish far more enjoyable. These kinds of kitchen habits rarely appeared in printed recipes. They were passed down through experience, shared between neighbors, written in margins of cookbooks, or taught quietly at the stove. And that's what makes meals like this so fascinating. They weren't just recipes. They were practical knowledge shaped by everyday cooks who learned how to stretch ingredients and solve problems with simple, clever solutions. Tuna noodle skillet supper. In the middle of the 20th century, few pantry items were as dependable as a simple can of tuna. It was inexpensive, easy to store, and ready whenever a quick supper was needed. Many Betty Crocker cookbooks from the 1950s and 1960s featured tuna in comforting family meals, but one of the most practical was the tuna noodle skillet supper. It was the kind of dish busy households relied on when time was short and ingredients were limited. The meal came together in a single pan. Egg noodles simmered until tender, then were mixed with canned tuna, a simple cream sauce, and sometimes a handful of peas or chopped celery. Everything cooked together into a warm, creamy skillet supper that could feed a whole family without much effort. It wasn't glamorous, but it was dependable and filling. But tucked behind this ordinary dish was another clever hillbilly-style cooking trick that many experienced home cooks quietly used. Instead of draining the tuna completely, they saved a spoonful of the liquid from the can and stirred it into the sauce. It might sound unusual, but that small addition added extra depth of flavor to the dish. The broth carried the natural taste of the fish, strengthening the overall flavor without needing extra seasoning. This trick was especially useful in rural kitchens where ingredients had to stretch further. Instead of wasting anything, cooks found ways to use every drop. The result was a richer, more satisfying supper made from the simplest ingredients. These small cooking habits remind us that old recipes weren't just instructions on a page. They were built around experience, creativity, and the quiet knowledge of people who learned to make the most out of what they had in their kitchens. Sloppy Joe's skillet supper. Few meals captured the spirit of mid-century American home cooking quite like the Sloppy Joe. It was messy, hearty, and incredibly practical. By the 1950s and 1960s, versions of this dish appeared in countless family cookbooks, including several Betty Crocker editions. For many households, It became a reliable supper when money was tight and time was short. The basic idea was simple. Ground beef browned in a skillet, then simmered with tomato sauce, onions, and a handful of pantry seasonings. Once the mixture thickened into a rich, slightly sweet sauce, it was piled onto soft hamburger buns. It was the kind of meal kids loved and parents could prepare in minutes. But experienced cooks often used a small hillbilly-style trick that made the dish even better. Instead of adding plain tomato sauce alone, many cooks stirred in a spoonful of leftover coffee from the morning pot. It sounds unusual today, but it was a quiet kitchen secret in some rural households. The coffee didn't make the dish taste like coffee at all. Instead, it deepened the flavor of the tomato sauce and balanced the sweetness with a subtle richness. This trick worked especially well when the sauce felt too sweet or flat. Just a small splash added complexity that made the whole skillet taste fuller and more satisfying. Like many old cooking habits, this idea rarely appeared in printed recipes. It was the kind of knowledge learned through experience, shared casually between neighbors or passed down from parents to children standing beside the stove. Meals like the Sloppy Joe remind us that classic American dishes weren't only about ingredients. They were shaped by small practical tricks that helped everyday cooks turn simple pantry foods into something memorable. Chicken a la king on toast. During the 1950s and early 1960s, few dishes felt as comforting or as elegant for a simple home supper as chicken a la king. It appeared frequently in Betty Crocker cookbooks and quickly became a favorite way to use leftover chicken. Warm, creamy, and filling, it was a meal that could turn yesterday's roast into a completely new dinner. The dish began with tender pieces of cooked chicken gently heated in a creamy white sauce made with butter, flour, and milk or cream. Mushrooms and diced green peppers were often added for flavor and texture. Once everything simmered together, the rich mixture was spooned over toast, biscuits, or sometimes fluffy rice. To many families, it felt almost fancy. But behind the scenes, practical cooks had a small hillbilly-style trick that made the dish even better. When reheating leftover chicken, the meat could sometimes become dry or tough in the sauce. Rural cooks solved this with a simple step. Before adding the chicken to the skillet, they lightly warmed it in a small splash of chicken broth or even a little milk. This gentle warming helped the meat absorb moisture again before it entered the sauce. The difference was noticeable. Instead of dry pieces of chicken sitting in the sauce, the meat stayed soft and tender, blending smoothly into the creamy mixture. This trick wasn't written in most cookbooks. It was learned through repetition and passed quietly from one cook to another. That's the beauty of these old suppers. They weren't only about recipes printed on a page. They were shaped by practical kitchen wisdom, small adjustments that made simple meals taste better and helped families get the most from every ingredient they had. Beef and potato skillet hash. For generations, one of the most dependable suppers in American kitchens was a simple skillet hash. Long before packaged meals filled grocery store shelves, cooks relied on practical dishes that used leftovers and pantry basics. Beef and potato skillet hash became one of those dependable meals, appearing in many mid-century home cookbooks and Betty Crocker meal guides. The idea behind the dish was straightforward. Leftover roast beef or ground beef was chopped and cooked in a hot skillet with diced potatoes and onions. As the mixture cooked, the potatoes slowly browned while the beef absorbed the flavors of the pan. Sometimes cooks added a little broth or a spoonful of gravy, turning the mixture into a hearty one-pan supper that could easily feed a family. But experienced home cooks had a clever hillbilly-style trick that made this dish far better than most people realize. Before adding the potatoes to the skillet, many cooks parboiled them for just a few minutes in salted water. This quick step softened the potatoes slightly without fully cooking them. Then, when they were added to the hot skillet, they browned beautifully on the outside while staying tender inside. Without this step, potatoes often cooked unevenly, burning on the outside while staying hard in the center. The quick parboil solved the problem completely. This simple trick saved time and guaranteed a better texture in the finished dish. It was the kind of practical knowledge that rarely appeared in recipe instructions. Instead, it came from years of cooking experience and was often shared between family members or neighbors. Meals like skillet hash remind us that many classic suppers weren't complicated at all. They were built on simple ingredients, smart techniques, and the quiet kitchen wisdom that made everyday cooking work. Salmon patties with pantry crackers. In many American kitchens during the 1940s and 1950s, canned salmon was considered a reliable staple. It was affordable, easy to store, and could quickly turn into a hearty meal when fresh meat wasn't available. One of the most common ways families used it was by making salmon patties, a simple supper that appeared in many Betty Crocker-era cookbooks. The recipe was straightforward. Canned salmon was mixed with eggs, crushed crackers, and a few simple seasonings. The mixture was shaped into small patties and fried in a skillet until the outside turned golden and crisp. Served with potatoes or simple vegetables, it became a filling dinner that required very little preparation. But home cooks who made this dish often relied on a small hillbilly-style kitchen trick that made the patties hold together much better. Sometimes the mixture could become too soft, causing the patties to fall apart in the skillet. Instead of adding more eggs or extra flour, experienced cooks used crushed pantry crackers very carefully. They added them slowly, a little at a time, allowing the crackers to absorb moisture from the salmon mixture. This method thickened the mixture naturally while keeping the patties light instead of dense. The crackers worked like a gentle binder, helping the patties stay firm when frying. Another benefit was flavor. As the patties cooked, the cracker crumbs helped create a crisp outer crust that made each bite more satisfying. Like many old kitchen tricks, this one rarely appeared in written recipes. It was something cooks learned through practice and quietly passed along to others. Small techniques like this remind us that classic home cooking was never only about ingredients. It was also about understanding how simple foods behaved in the pan. Hamburger shepherd's pie. In mid-century America, there was a particular comfort in meals that combined practicality with heartiness, and hamburger shepherd's pie perfectly embodied that. It wasn't fancy, but it stretched inexpensive ingredients into a filling, family-friendly supper. Many Betty Crocker cookbooks included variations of this dish, showing busy home cooks how to turn ground beef, vegetables, and pantry staples into a hot, satisfying meal. The preparation was simple. Ground beef was browned with onions and sometimes a dash of Worcestershire sauce for depth. Leftover vegetables, like peas or carrots, were stirred in along with a bit of broth to create a savory base. Then came the crowning touch, a layer of mashed potatoes spread across the top. The whole pan went into the oven until the potatoes browned lightly and the filling bubbled with flavor. But experienced cooks often had a small hillbilly-style trick to make this classic even better. Instead of using plain mashed potatoes, some cooks mixed in a spoonful of sharp cheese or a bit of sour cream. This addition wasn't just for taste. It added creaminess, moisture, and a slight tang that helped the topping stay soft while baking, preventing it from drying out in the oven. A lightly greased baking dish also ensured the bottom layer didn't stick or burn. Another subtle trick involved seasoning the meat thoroughly before spreading the potatoes. Rural cooks knew that flavor often needed to be built layer by layer, and seasoning early ensured that every bite had depth. These techniques were rarely listed in formal recipes. They were learned over time, through trial, error, and quiet kitchen wisdom. Hamburger shepherd's pie reminds us that these old suppers were more than instructions. They were lessons in practical cooking, showing how simple tricks and careful attention could turn humble ingredients into something comforting, delicious, and memorable. Chicken and rice casserole. In the mid-20th century, casseroles were the backbone of American home cooking, especially for families looking for affordable, filling meals. Among these, chicken and rice casserole was a staple in many Betty Crocker cookbooks, combining pantry staples with leftover chicken to create a warm, comforting supper that could feed a family with minimal fuss. The dish started with cooked chicken, either roasted or boiled, cut into bite-sized pieces. Rice was added, sometimes pre-cooked, sometimes cooked directly in the casserole, and a creamy sauce bound everything together. Many home cooks included simple seasonings like salt, pepper, and paprika, while some added a can of cream of mushroom or cream of chicken soup to enrich the flavor. Once assembled, the casserole was baked until the rice absorbed the sauce and the top became lightly golden. Yet, this seemingly straightforward dish often relied on a clever hillbilly-style trick that many modern cooks have forgotten. Before adding the chicken to the casserole, experienced cooks would gently poach it in broth or milk for a few minutes. This extra step ensured the chicken stayed moist during baking, preventing it from drying out, a common problem in oven-baked casseroles. Additionally, some cooks added a small pat of butter on top of the rice before baking. As the casserole cooked, the butter melted, creating a golden, flavorful crust that added richness and kept the surface from becoming overly dry. These small techniques weren't printed in most cookbooks. They were learned through hands-on experience and quietly passed down from one cook to the next, often in whispered tips beside the stove. Chicken and rice casserole illustrates how old American suppers were more than simple recipes. They were practical, comforting solutions, shaped by small kitchen tricks that transformed everyday ingredients into something far more delicious and memorable. Salisbury steak with onion gravy. In the kitchens of 1950s America, Salisbury steak was one of those dependable dinners that could turn inexpensive ground beef into a hearty, satisfying meal. It appeared frequently in Betty Crocker cookbooks and was a staple for families looking for a filling supper that could be served on short notice. What made it special wasn't just the meat, it was the rich, savory onion gravy that made every bite comforting. The dish began with seasoned ground beef, shaped into patties and lightly browned in a skillet. Onions were sautéed until soft and golden, then combined with broth, a touch of flour, and sometimes a dash of Worcestershire sauce to create a thick, flavorful gravy. The patties were returned to the pan, simmering gently until they absorbed the rich sauce. Simple mashed potatoes or buttered noodles often completed the plate, turning humble ingredients into a complete meal. But behind this seemingly straightforward recipe, home cooks often used a clever hillbilly-style trick that isn't written in most cookbooks. Before browning the patties, some cooks sprinkled a tiny pinch of baking soda over the beef. It sounds unusual, but this step helped the meat stay tender and juicy during cooking, preventing it from becoming dry or tough. Another subtle tip involved slowly caramelizing the onions over low heat. Instead of rushing, rural cooks let the natural sugars develop, producing a gravy with deep, rich flavor that elevated even the simplest supper. These little tricks weren't formal instructions. They were learned through experience, trial, and quiet guidance passed from one cook to the next. Salisbury steak reminds us that classic American suppers weren't just about following recipes. They were built on small, practical techniques that enhanced flavor, texture, and enjoyment, proving that even modest ingredients could create something truly memorable at the family table. Tuna melt casserole. By the 1960s, tuna melt casserole had quietly earned a place in American kitchens as a warm, practical supper. It was the perfect solution for families with limited time or ingredients, combining canned tuna, cheese, and bread or crackers into a filling one-dish meal. Appearing in mid-century Betty Crocker cookbooks, this casserole offered a way to turn simple pantry staples into a comforting dinner that could feed the whole family. The dish started with canned tuna mixed into a creamy base, often made from milk, butter, and flour. Some cooks added a can of cream of mushroom soup for extra richness. Shredded cheese was stirred into the mixture, and the casserole was topped with breadcrumbs or crushed crackers for a golden, crispy finish. The pan went into the oven until bubbling and lightly browned, producing a meal that was both simple and satisfying. Yet, like many old recipes, it held a hillbilly-style trick that made it truly stand out. Experienced cooks knew that canned tuna could sometimes be dry or overly salty. To balance this, they added a small spoonful of mayonnaise or even a dash of milk to the tuna before mixing it into the casserole. This softened the texture and created a smoother, creamier filling. Another subtle technique involved lightly buttering the topping of breadcrumbs or crackers. As the casserole baked, the butter melted, forming a crisp, golden crust while keeping the interior moist and flavorful. These little hacks weren't part of the printed instructions, they were learned over time, passed quietly from one cook to the next. Tuna melt casserole shows how classic American suppers weren't just about following a recipe. They were practical, clever, and comforting meals, shaped by small kitchen tricks that elevated simple ingredients into a warm, satisfying dish families returned to again and again. And there you have it, 10 forgotten Betty Crocker suppers, each brought to life with surprisingly useful hillbilly-style cooking tricks that actually work. These meals remind us that home cooking wasn't just about following a recipe, it was about practical wisdom, creativity, and making the most of simple ingredients. From creamed chipped beef to tuna melt casserole, every dish carries the legacy of generations who knew how to stretch, enhance, and transform humble pantry staples into something comforting and memorable. If you loved this journey into vintage American kitchens, make sure to subscribe and join us as we uncover even more lost recipes.